bring us back to July 21st. How many people were at the event? Was there mingling between tables? Was there music?
Well, first of all, I just want to express my regret at the fact that I attended that event and that has led to this controversy. And I want to say sorry to the hospitality industry in particular. They're struggling to get open again. It doesn't help them that guidelines are changing and that they're unclear at times. And also to any members of the public who are confused about what the rules are, because I know most people try to stick to the rules, and when there's confusion about them, that makes it harder for people. And also to my colleagues, for whom this has been a distraction from the regular work of government. But I do want to say very clearly and state this very clearly that the event was not in breach of the government regulations in place at the time, which allowed for outdoor gatherings of over 200, and probably wasn't in breach of the Fáilte Ireland guidelines at the time either.
Probably wasn't in breach.
And that's part of the difficulty. They weren't clear. And they have changed twice actually since then. They've changed 35 times since the pandemic began, and were largely silent on outdoor events. Said at the time that you couldn't book 2 tables, for example, indoors, but didn't say anything about outdoors. And that's one of the reasons why we clarified those guidelines today. But it certainly wasn't all about the event in the Merrion. You've seen people there from the live music industry very pleased that they can perform outdoors again. But there was no live music at this event. So,
yes,
so as you can see,
well, let's go back to that event,
unconnected.
because you said in a statement, and you've just said now, that you are confident that you didn't breach the regulations, and that was clarified by the Attorney General. However, the guidelines, all of the hospitality industry have come out to say they weren't aware that you were allowed to have events of this size. Why didn't they know? Well, you're the Minister for Enterprise.
Yeah, and it's been suggested by some people that I negotiated these guidelines. I didn't. That's a political charge made up by Sinn Féin. And it's also been suggested that those guidelines are approved by Cabinet, and they're not. And they weren't approved by the Cabinet subcommittee today.
OK, you're suggesting,
so
though, that you have no role there, though.
Oh, no, they do have a role. And I think what is confusing for everyone, the easiest thing you can do in a pandemic is shut the country down. The second easiest thing you can do is open it up again. But when you're doing what we're trying to do now, which is to open in a stepwise, safe pattern, there will be anomalies and there will be inconsistencies. And there are actually 4 levels of rules. There are the government regulations, which trump everything because they have a statutory basis. There's government advice, there's NEFIT advice, which is sometimes different from government advice. And then there are sectoral guidelines.
Okay,
and these are sectoral
nobody
guidelines.
in the sector understood the guidelines as you now say they were.
Well, I think that's why it was important to clarify them.
But they must have lost so much money because of this. They've already been closed, some of them, for a year and a half. You're saying now as Minister, well, sorry, we just never updated the guidelines. That's not good enough, really, is it?
Well, actually, the guidelines are updated regularly. And they were updated twice, actually, since the event in the Merrion, 35
since the event,
times.
Though.
Yeah, but not because of the event. They were updated 2 days after the event, actually, and obviously that had nothing to do with the event. They've been updated between 30 and 35 times since last June.
OK, well, lots of people would say you have updated them to suit yourself. Have you updated them to suit yourself?
No, the reason why they are updated is sometimes there's changes in public health advice, and sometimes issues, anomalies and requests from the industries arise, and we update them, we change them. So obviously we needed to clarify the issue around outdoor gatherings, and that was done. But as you can see, the issue around live music, for example, was not an issue at all. There was no music at this event. And we've also indicated that communions will begin in September, and the Taoiseach is going to engage formally with the Church about that.
But going back to that date, because that's what the industry is concerned about. They were of the understanding that you could not hold an event of this size, you could not book multiple tables, you could not mingle between tables, yet it happened. Why do they not know it was allowed to happen?
Well, there were outdoor events, and there have been outdoor events happening around the country for many weeks now. And that regulation was published. It was reported, including by RTE.
But the guidelines didn't say that.
And that's the difficulty. And there were outdoor events happening in sports clubs, outdoor events happening, concerts in public parks, events happening in towns and villages. Where the difficulty arose is a hospitality setting, a garden of a hotel, and that's what was different on this occasion.
Do you accept that the guidelines were breached? Perhaps not the regulations, as you're saying.
Well, in fairness, nobody is saying that the regulations were breached.
But what about the guidelines? Black and white. Because that's what businesses were operating to, the Fáilte Ireland guidelines.
I don't believe that the guidelines were breached, but I do accept that they were ambiguous and they were open to interpretation. And, for example, you mentioned the issue of not being able to book 2 tables. The version of the guidelines that was in place on the 21st of June said that you couldn't book 2 tables outdoors. Indoors, and was silent on the issue of outdoors. And that's what we've sought to clarify this week, is so that we actually are clear about is and is not allowed outdoors.
Do you apologise to the industry for letting them down then, for failing to communicate as Minister for Enterprise on what they were and they weren't allowed to do?
Yeah, absolutely. I did that earlier and I'm happy to do that again. You know, this is an industry that I've been working with for a long time, since I was Tourism Minister all those years ago, my first job in government. It's a great industry. They've been through a rotten period in the last year and a half. I really feel for them. They're back up on their feet again. Things are starting to move forward again for them. And the last thing they need is a lack of clarity around guidelines, or guidelines changing frequently, because that makes the job harder for them as business people, harder for their staff, and makes things more confusing for the public. And I absolutely regret any role that I've had in this. But I hope the fact that we've been able to clarify the guidelines today and also make some progress in other areas is good news.
Are you concerned that you may have undermined public health advice?
Well, you know, I hope not. But like I do acknowledge, as I said earlier, that it can be confusing for people. For my part, I probably let my guard down. I did do a treble check. You know, I checked the regulations, the ones that I sign off on, the ones I'm familiar with. I checked with the organiser of the event. I checked with the manager of the hotel as I arrived to make sure that it was compliant. If I had gone through the regulations, it actually wouldn't have been clear, because the regulations on that day were silent on.
Do you understand why that's so confusing for people? You make the rules and you had to check. And yet people are being told they can't do certain things and they don't know what they can do.
I absolutely appreciate how confusing it is, because if it's confusing for me as a government minister and as a legislator, imagine how confusing it is for people you know, who are involved in their everyday lives and don't have the time to be reading guidelines and going on gov.ie and looking at 50-page Fáilte documents. So I absolutely appreciate the confusion.
Will it be made clearer in future for people?
Yes, and that's part of what we agreed that we would do at government level today. We agreed that we'll meet again on the 19th of August and again on the 26th of August, and we would then have a revised roadmap on how we can ease all of the remaining restrictions. So that's the return to the office, it's entertainment and the arts, it's also indoor sports and leisure, because they're going to want to know when we're going to ease restrictions. And one of the things that we reflected on today as a government is that it would make more sense to do something you know, across sectors and clear, perhaps a little bit like what they've been doing in Wales and Scotland and so on, rather than having ever more complicated intermeshing different sets of rules and regulations that, you know, are different depending on the different type of garden you're in. And we have made it very complicated for people, and I do regret that. And part of my job now is to try and resolve that.
All right, very briefly, will that UN envoy position be filled?
Well, that's to be decided. These are not the first envoys that we've had. We've had special envoys before. This is the first time it's been controversial, probably because we've been doing it on an ad hoc basis and lessons have been learned from that. It still makes sense to have that role. That role would be of value, but obviously we'll have to do a review, and the Department of Foreign Affairs and Minister Comey is going to do that, and we'll make a decision on that in the autumn.
OK, Tánaiste Leo Varadkar, thanks for coming in to speak to us.